All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. We got a really good one for you guys today.
I do.
You guys sent us some pretty interesting excerpts, actually, from a book
Oh, yeah.
called Bottomline Bodybuilding.
Yeah, Bottomline Bodybuilding by Nelson Montana.
Nelson Montana, that's right. Now, this guy, he's been around the bodybuilding scene for, I think,
Over 3 decades.
over 3 decades. Yeah, like he knows what's up. So
Yeah, he's got a very, very sort of direct style. And what we have are some excerpts that you guys pulled out that you thought were interesting. And so we're going to sort of dive into this and try to unpack some of his key ideas around training and nutrition and just his general philosophy.
Yeah, and some of the more
Controversial.
aspects of bodybuilding, right? I mean, he
Yeah.
definitely has some opinions. So right off the bat, he talks about just how he's going to deliver this information. And he says, I'm here to tell you the straight, gritty truth. He says, if that comes across as being too blunt or not politically correct or perhaps even gruff, he says, then so be it.
Well, he doesn't care. He's just trying to give you
That's right.
the bottom line.
He's like, this is the way it is. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm going to tell you what's up.
Right.
Which is refreshing, I think, in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah.
But he doesn't hold back.
Especially these days,
Right.
where everybody's sort of tiptoeing around so many different issues for fear of offending anybody. It's like, just tell me the truth. I want to know what's what.
Yeah.
So he's not afraid to voice his opinions and some of his beliefs.
Right.
So right off the bat, it's like, okay, well, this is going to be interesting.
Right. Okay. So this guy's, this is going to be a wild ride.
Right.
So one of the first kind of really interesting things about this is that right out of the gate, he talks about performance-enhancing drugs.
Right.
And, you know, and this is bottom-line bodybuilding. So you figure, okay, well, this guy's going to
Going to
be...
be all about it.
Yeah, he's just going to be like...
Yeah, how to get the most out of your anabolics.
How to shoot up and all this stuff. But really, he's...
Well, he's not
promoting it. He's not saying it's good. In fact, he kind of calls it a last resort. He says that, you know, really you should exhaust all of your natural abilities before even considering that.
Years of training naturally.
Yeah.
To sort of reach your genetic potential as much as you can naturally.
Right.
Before you even consider that route.
Right. And then he really strongly advises education. He's like, you've got to be informed. You've got to understand the risks. You've got to understand how these things work. And,
you know what you're getting into.
Yeah. And also very interestingly is that he has a lot of respect for natural athletes.
Yeah.
He's like, there's guys out there who have amazing physiques and they're not taking anything.
Right.
And that's something to be really admired.
Yes. And also, you know, we have this sort of, in our current climate, it seems to be this idea that, oh, if you build an impressive physique, it must be steroids.
Right.
That's just automatic. Whereas he's like, no. You can build an impressive physique naturally. You just got to work your ass off.
Right. And so, which is really cool because that's kind of what we always say is like, you don't know.
Right.
Like if someone's taking something or not. And also, what's the point of even worrying about it? Just worry about yourself.
Right. Yeah. Focus on your own journey.
Right. So, yeah, that's really interesting. And then he gets into talking about, you know, modern bodybuilding.
Right.
He has an opinion on that as well. He seems to be kind of critical of modern bodybuilding.
He is.
Saying that, you know, a lot of these guys today, they're taking way more than, you know, even the guys back in Arnold's day, you know, Sergio Oliva, all these kinds of guys.
Right.
And the results aren't necessarily that much better. So you got to wonder, what's the point?
Yeah, the diminishing returns factor and also the health consequences.
Right.
And also that, you know, it's just gotten so extreme.
Right.
That that it's almost like a caricature of what it used to be.
Right.
And he's not into that.
No.
He prefers the more classic.
Like the golden era, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then he gets into the topic of Clomid. Now, Clomid is often touted as like a must-have.
Yeah, post-psychotherapy.
Post-psychotherapy drug, right? It's supposed to help your...
Restart your natural testosterone production after you come off a cycle of anabolic steroids.
Right. And so he's got a really interesting take on this because it seems like he had a personal bad experience with it.
He did.
Oh, yeah.
He claims that it actually did the opposite.
Yes.
It made it worse for him.
It made his recovery worse.
Yeah.
It was harder to get his libido back, his testicular size, and his natural testosterone levels.
Right.
And so he calls it a big lie.
Yeah.
And he says that, you know, maybe my experience was unique, but, you know, this is what happened to me.
Right. And he just doesn't buy into that whole idea that, oh, it's an absolute must that you have to use Clomid.
Right.
He says that's, you know, it's just not true.
And then what's even more interesting is his his take on anti-estrogens
Right.
as a whole.
Yeah, he's not a fan.
He's like, first of all, you need estrogen.
Yes.
Like, guys need estrogen.
You need some level of it, yeah.
For libido and for other things.
Right. And he points out that, with a moderate dose of steroids, your aromatization, meaning how much of that testosterone converts to estrogen, may be minimal.
Right.
So if you then take an anti-estrogen, you may be pushing your estrogen too low.
Right. You could be getting rid of it.
Which is bad.
Yeah.
You need some estrogen.
Right. And then he makes a really interesting point about
the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, the golden era, right?
The golden era of bodybuilding, where these guys, they weren't using anti-estrogens. They just weren't a thing.
Right.
And there were very few cases of gynecomastia.
Right. So that's something to think about. Like, how necessary are these things? Now, instead of Clomid, he kind of recommends Proviron. And the reasoning here is that DHT, which is the active part of Proviron, has some effects on breast tissue.
Right. It acts as an anti-estrogen. It's antagonistic to gyno.
Yeah, it kind of, blocks the estrogen in that area specifically.
Right.
And he even mentions that topical DHT has been shown to help reduce gyno in some cases. So that's interesting.
Especially if it's not too severe, in the early stages.
So, so he's got some definite opinions on, estrogen blockers and all that kind of stuff. And then he gets into the, overall facts about steroids. He says these are the indisputable facts about steroids, right?
This is his bottom line on steroids.
This is what you need to know. Okay, so number 1, they work.
Right.
2, people will use them.
Yeah.
3, the debate about their dangers and benefits will continue.
Right.
That's it. That's the bottom line. And so...
And he goes on to say that, he's been accused by, people on both sides of the issue, people that are very anti-steroids and people that are very pro-steroids of being, in the other camp. And he says, you know what, I'm just trying to present an honest and balanced view of it.
Right.
As a conservative user, as he calls himself, of anabolic steroids, I think I can offer a viewpoint that is perhaps more accurate than either extreme.
Right. So it's interesting. He's being criticized from both sides, which probably means he's somewhere in the middle,
Yeah. Which probably means he's getting it right.
Right. Yeah.
If you're pissing off everybody, you're probably onto something.
Right. Exactly. So he also gets into the war on drugs and the propaganda that's out there about anabolic steroids.
Right.
And he's like, this whole thing about buying drugs supports terrorists. He's like, that's BS. That's a complete lie.
Right.
He's like, making these things illegal is what drives the black market and fuels the very organizations that they're trying to, stop.
Right.
So it's kind of like prohibition.
Yeah, exactly. Like it doesn't really work and it has all these unintended consequences.
Right.
So that's interesting. He also then has a very firm stance on some other substances.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He's like, these things do not belong in bodybuilding. Clenbuterol, insulin, DNP.
Cytomel. Nubane, Synthol, RU486, dopamine, diuretics. He's like, these are dangerous substances, and they have no place in bodybuilding.
No place. These are not things that you should be messing with if you're trying to build a better physique. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. He has this kind of paradoxical idea about steroids and health.
Right. He says steroids can be good for your health.
Right.
Which on the surface seems contradictory.
It sounds contradictory, but what he's really trying to differentiate is the
use versus abuse.
Right. Like there's a responsible way to use these things.
Right.
And then there's a way that's just going to destroy your body.
So he's talking about responsible use. And he argues that there are certain health benefits that you can get from, using steroids responsibly. So what are some of these benefits? He says less stress, you feel better about yourself, you look better, quicker recovery from illnesses, higher growth hormone levels, improved T3. And he clarifies he's talking about killer T cells.
Right.
Not thyroid hormone.
Right, thyroid hormone.
Increased blood volume and lower cortisol.
Yeah, which cortisol is the stress hormone. So if you can lower your stress hormone, that's good.
And also increased blood volume is good for, delivering nutrients, getting rid of waste products.
Recovery,
all that kind of stuff. So these are all, potentially positive effects.
Right.
And then he gets into the concept of receptor site saturation.
Right.
Which is that if you use steroids for a long period of time, you're basically filling up all these receptor sites and they become less
Less sensitive.
Sensitive.
Right.
So you need more to get the same effect.
Right. So the law of diminishing returns, basically.
Yeah. And then he also talks about cortisol backlash.
Right.
Which is that after you come off a cycle, if you've been using for a long time, your cortisol levels may actually go up.
Right.
Higher than they were before.
Right. Because your body's trying to compensate for the fact that you've been suppressing it.
So that's not good, obviously.
No.
And then he also talks about the possibility of psychological dependence.
Right. Right.
And, there's obviously, debate on whether that's
of course
a real thing.
Yeah.
But it's something to consider.
Right.
Now, here's where it gets really practical. He talks about the misconception of milligram strength.
Right.
And he uses this analogy, this example of Winstrol and Anadrol.
Right.
And he's like, people think that Anadrol is stronger because they see it in 50 milligram tabs.
Right.
And then they see Winstrol in 2 milligram tabs.
What?
He's like, no, that's not how it works. He's like, Winstrol has a higher affinity for the receptor sites.
Right.
So milligram per milligram, it's actually much stronger.
Right. So an equal amount of Winstrol is actually going to be much more effective than an equal amount of Anadrol.
And he goes on to say that Anadrol is actually really harsh on the liver. It doesn't have good receptor affinity.
Right. And he actually makes a joke. He's like, you take a bunch of Anadrol and you gain all this weight and then you piss it all away because it's just water.
Right. And he's like, it goes away really quickly, which is not a good thing. And then he also makes a point about orals versus injectables.
Right.
He's like, milligrams per milligram, the orals are generally stronger and faster acting than the injectables.
Right.
But the injectables tend to be more practical for, long-term health reasons.
Right.
And so then he gets into this really important concept of the anabolic androgenic ratio.
Right.
Now, this
is key to understanding, I think. His whole philosophy about steroids.
Right.
He says that it's the androgenic component of the steroid that is hard on your endocrine system.
Right.
And that's what's going to cause a lot of the side effects.
Right.
And so the goal is to use just enough androgen to stimulate growth.
Right.
And then to really focus on the anabolic component.
Right. So the anabolic is the stuff that's building the muscle.
Right.
The androgenic is the stuff that's giving you...
It's giving you the side effects.
Yeah, and their male characteristics.
Yeah.
So you want to use just enough androgen to get the growth and then focus on the anabolic to get what he calls quality gains.
Right. Safe and quality gains.
Right. So that's a really important concept. And then he gets into the use of HCG.
Right. Human chorionic gonadotropin.
So this is a drug that's typically used for fertility stimulation.
Right.
But bodybuilders have kind of adapted it for their own purposes, which is basically to try to maintain testicular function during a cycle and to aid recovery afterwards. And so he has this kind of interesting recommendation.
Yeah, he has a very specific protocol.
Yeah, he says, instead of doing like the big blasts once a week, he says, do lower doses.
More frequently.
More frequently. So like 200 to 500 IU in total, spread over like 4 daily shots for 1 week.
Right, because what happens is if you do those big 1,000, 2,000 IU blasts once a week, you get this huge surge in estrogen, which can lead to gyno.
Yeah.
So he says, frequent low dose to avoid that.
Avoid the estrogen spike.
Right.
And then he also recommends that while you're doing that, you run proviron and calcium deglucarate.
Right.
And he's like, again, don't use Clomid.
Right.
So that's pretty interesting. And then he gets into the topic of mail order muscle.
Right.
Now, this is the whole thing about
buying steroids online.
And he has some
He has some strong opinions on that.
He's like, if you see a website
advertising openly.
Yeah, that's advertising it openly, it's probably a scam.
Yeah, it's probably a scam.
It's probably just some guy trying to take your money.
Right.
And you're never going to see the product, so be very wary of that.
Yeah.
He also talks about those DEA confiscation letters that you might get. He's like, just ignore them.
Yeah.
Like, treat them like junk mail. Don't even worry about it.
Just throw them in the trash.
Yeah. And then he gets into the topic of pro-hormones.
Right.
Now he has some...
He doesn't like pro-hormones.
He doesn't like them.
No. He thinks they're...
He actually quotes an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that states that pro-hormones primarily raise estrogen levels. And he says, my advice has never resulted in that outcome.
Right.
But he's like, these pro-hormones, all they're going to do is raise your estrogen levels.
Right. So not a good thing in his opinion.
No, he's not a fan of those. Now, a little bit about Nelson Montana himself, so the guy who wrote this book, he has an interesting background. He's actually
a musician.
A musician. He was a personal trainer, but he
transitioned away from that.
Yeah, he shifted away from that.
He went back to music.
Yeah, he mostly just teaches music now.
Right.
And then he still has a few like long-term clients that he'll help out. But he said he's kind of like their therapist at this point, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
And he also mentions that he's, done a little bit of acting in his past.
But his main focus is teaching music.
Music is his...
That's his passion.
Passion, yeah. So he says that he kind of developed these controversial training principles during this period where he was kind of like stepping back from personal training.
From the day-to-day grind of personal training.
Yeah. And so he says he took like a more abstract and analytical approach.
Right.
To trying to understand how the body
responds to exercise.
Yeah. And he says, interestingly, he realized that a lot of his ideas
aligned with Vince Gironda.
Yeah, Vince Gironda.
Which, Vince Gironda was a legendary bodybuilder and trainer.
Right.
Known for his unconventional methods.
Right.
And so he's like, wow, I came up with these ideas on my own, and they actually align with what this guy was saying.
Right. And then he also says he relies on, like, common sense.
Right.
He's like, I don't need studies and all these kinds of things. Like, I've been doing this. I see what works.
Just look at the results.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening in the real world.
Right. And he also says, he hasn't been very popular as a speaker because his views often contradict mainstream fitness advice.
Yeah, he's not afraid to go against the grain.
No.
Which, again, I kind of like that about him.
Yeah, it's refreshing.
It's refreshing.
And then he says that he's not really into bodybuilding shows.
Yeah, he's not into the whole bodybuilding symposium scene, the whole dog and pony show.
Right.
He's just like, I'm here to train and, help people.
Right.
And, he doesn't need all the hoopla.
Right. And then he has some experiences with some, pretty big names in the industry, muscle media, testosterone.
Right.
And he has an interesting take on this. He's like, these magazines, he's like, they kind of shifted their focus away from the hardcore.
To appeal to a wider audience, to the beginner supplement user.
Right.
Because that's where the money is.
That's where the money is. He's like, they want to sell supplements.
Right.
So they're not going to be talking about, all this other crazy stuff.
Right.
And then he also mentions that he was a big contributor to Testosterone magazine in the early days.
Yeah. He actually wrote a lot of the articles for Testosterone.
Yeah.
Under different names, pen names.
Yeah. Yeah. And he says he eventually left because of, creative differences.
Right.
And he also has a funny anecdote about
Bill Roberts,
where they had like an
email exchange.
Yeah, like a nasty email exchange.
A very pointed email exchange.
Yeah, where he's just like, screw you.
Yeah.
So, obviously there's some interesting personalities in this industry.
Right.
And then he also gives his take on some of the biotest products.
Yeah.
He's like, Tribex and Power Drive he thinks are decent.
Decent but overpriced.
Overpriced. GROW he thinks is unpalatable. Like he couldn't even stomach it.
Yeah.
And he says most of the other stuff is just snake oil.
Yeah. He's not impressed.
And he's also kind of critical of Bruce Sneller and his evolution into a, supplement marketer.
Right.
He's like, this guy's just trying to sell stuff now. Yeah. So, it's interesting to kind of see his perspective on
the supplement industry.
Yeah.
He's very skeptical.
Right.
Very skeptical.
So nutrition, the bottom line.
Right. So this is his
take.
This is his approach to nutrition.
Yeah.
He says most diets are either scams or based on ignorance.
Right.
He's like, look, it comes down to a very simple equation. Calories in versus calories out.
Right. He's like, if you eat more calories than you burn, you're going to gain weight.
You're going to gain weight.
If you burn more calories than you eat, you're going to lose weight.
You're going to lose weight.
It's really that simple.
That's the bottom line.
Now, he uses this this kind of analogy, this thing about Fruit Loops versus steak.
Right.
And he's like, if you eat a box of Fruit Loops, you're going to gain weight. He's like, if you eat a big steak, you're going to gain weight.
Right.
He's like, it's not.
It's the calories.
Yeah. He's like, it's not about, whether it's clean or dirty. It's about the calories.
Right.
But he does make a really strong point about protein.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, protein is crucial for metabolism.
For muscle growth.
Muscle growth, satiety, all these kinds of things.
For everything. Yeah.
And he also says that, you want to try to avoid the sugar-induced fat storage that happens when you eat too much sugar.
When your insulin spikes.
Yeah. So he really emphasizes protein at every meal.
Every meal.
He suggests like a 40-30 split.
Right. 40% protein, 30% carbs, 30% fat.
As a general guideline.
Right.
But he says, you know, you want to have a variety of protein sources. You want to have simple and complex carbs. You want to have
saturated and unsaturated fats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he even suggests supplementing with omega-3s.
Right. Yeah.
But here's the thing. He's like, don't obsess over a perfectly clean diet. He's like, it's not going to make much of a difference. He's like, food is fuel.
Right.
And it's also meant to be enjoyed.
Right.
So that's kind of a refreshing take, right?
It is.
Because I think a lot of bodybuilders get so caught up in like eating perfectly clean and they miss out on
Just make it a chore.
Yeah.
It's like you got to enjoy your food.
Yeah.
You know, if it's just a chore, you're not going to stick with it.
Yeah. And it's not going to be sustainable. So he then gets into the topic of thyroid.
Right. The thyroid gland.
And its role in fat loss. So
this is interesting.
He calls the thyroid the furnace.
The furnace of your body?
Yeah.
The fat-burning furnace.
He's like, this is what's burning the fat, right?
All right.
And he says that there's a few things that can hinder thyroid function.
Yes.
One is obviously hypothyroidism,
right,
which is a medical condition.
Right.
And then he says subpar thyroid, which he says is actually very common.
Very common.
Yeah, just like a lot of people have.
Yeah, their thyroid's just not...
It's not functioning optimally.
Functioning optimally.
He also says cruciferous vegetables can have a negative effect on thyroid function.
Yeah, because they contain goitrogens, which can inhibit T3 production.
Right. Now, he also says something really interesting. He says melatonin.
Melatonin can lower your body temperature.
Yeah.
Which is not good.